You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your co-host for today, John Wood Jr. Welcome back, folks. And I am joined today by a few of my very favorite people, I have to tell you. One is a name that you will know, Miss Monica Guzman, co-founder of the Evergrey in Seattle. How are you doing today, Monica?
Doing all right. Doing good. Glad to be here.
Good to hear. We are also joined by the one, the only, the distinguished, the fabulous, the brilliant, the talented, and the very much underhyped Joy Donnell, founder for the Center for Intersectional Media. Joy, it's so good to have you here today. How you doing?
Thank you. I'm here.
She is here. She is present, and her light is shining. No, very happy to have you here, Joy. And we will be joined, I believe, by Miss Maleena Lawrence of Deeprooted Entertainment. I think Maleena is going to join us midstream, so we'll be happy to welcome her when she jumps in, when she gets here. But for now, let's get the conversation going because the clock is moving. Ladies, first of all, once again, great to be here. I was interested in having the two of you and also Maleena on for this conversation because I think that we're sort of in this, we're in this strange like anti-flow in American life right now, where you have all of these currents and streams of political communication and social, activism taking place, where everybody is trying to sort of tell a story about what is true in American life, particularly with respect to race, particularly with respect to sort of how different groups of people are experiencing political reality. And yet, I oftentimes don't get the sense that as Americans, and particularly, between, maybe a lot of white Americans and a lot of people of color, that there is a strong understanding of the experiences that kind of underwrite our points of view in politics. And so that makes it difficult to communicate across lines of race. You two are both media entrepreneurs. You two are both, Joy, Monica, you two are both individuals, I think, who have in different ways learned how to sort of anchor yourselves in your personal cultural experiences, but speak to a wide range of folks on issues pertaining to race and beyond that. Joy, I want to start with you, and this is a free-flowing conversation. Anybody can ask anybody anything. But when you look out at sort of the racial conversation broadly, and you can talk about it in terms of black and white and so forth, what keeps us from being able to communicate effectively with respect to race? Do you have an instinct as far as that goes?
Well, I don't think that it's just one thing that keeps us from having deeper conversations about race and the trauma around how race has been used as a weapon of classism, which is really what it is. And what we have been discovering, I guess a lot of what's been coming forward for people who are buying the anti-racist reading list on Amazon and getting into the book clubs and having conversation is that what we know of as white America has not really had to think about race and has not had to think about how everyone else got racialized in relation to them. So there's also a lack of range, cultural range, and reading that has not happened, history that has not been shared, and that has created a bit of an empathy barrier. And I find it, really interesting. I talk to people who are very cultured, very well educated, very much even ally-minded, if you will. And, I can ask them things like, are you an ancient Greek or an ancient Roman? And they'll be like, no. And I say, but off the top of your head, could you name, if you had to, 5 to 10 ancient Greek and ancient, Roman gods? They're like, yeah. And they rattle them off. Then I ask, can you name 10 ancient African gods that are not Egyptian? Most of the time, they can't even name one. I use that question as kind of foundation for the fact that something has gone on in the education system, in the cultural system, in the dialogue and the idea of everything that is America in this country, that has not just created a very narrow view of the world for a lot of what is white America, but also robbed people of a natural curiosity about other people in this country. And so if you don't even have curiosity, you're not going to ask why. And why is a part of empathy and compassion and love. So if you're not asking why when someone starts to talk about their emotional struggles in relation to something that tries to define them outside of themselves and rob them of their natural, their spiritual ability to be who they are supposed to be in the world, that you don't even have the same floor for the conversation. And that's just kind of what I see. And it's kind of been everything. That's why people are seeing every single institution, every single system, every single industry is being called into question right now by even especially the young generation that's waking up to this for the first time and realizing there's so much that they didn't get communicated about.
Now, it's interesting because, first of all, that definitely resonates, right? So when you're talking about Black American and certainly African American history, even going back beyond slavery, there's this sort of cultural and historical backdrop that's not necessarily there for Americans in general, and I think even, you know, speaking as a black man, even for a lot of African Americans ourselves, right? And so that's one interesting aspect to this. But I think your larger point is that when you lack some of that larger sort of understanding of what the kind of cultural origins are of other groups, it can be a little bit difficult for us to have kind of an edifying conversation across some of these racial divides, perhaps because our frameworks are just so different. And we're just looking at each other as we're experiencing the politics of the now and not understanding how history has kind of led us to the moment that we're in. Monica, curious to ask you, by the way, we are now joined by Maleena Lawrence. Maleena, how you doing today? The founder of Deeprooted Entertainment, by the way. Good to see you, Maleena. Monica, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this question. Is there a way in which just sort of part of the problem with empathizing across racial divides has to do with a lack of cultural familiarity, I guess perhaps historically and in other ways? How much of a role do you see that as playing in the current kinds of limitations of the conversation? And is there another aspect to this question that you might also think is salient?
Yeah, I definitely also resonated with a lot of what Joy was saying. Particularly, Joy, you were talking about this moment feels different because it feels like a white awakening, where other moments just didn't reach that level or for whatever reason. And as you said that, I thought about the concept of we and us, who America considers the we and the us. And for so long, invisibly, that we was very white. That was the norm, the normal. That was the culture that you were supposed to learn and be fluent in. And the other cultures of America were secondary, right? Everything else was sort of secondary. And the normal experience is the white experience. And that's been such a shock to the cultural system, I think, observing it from where I sit, which, has been sort of an interesting place for me in all of this, like so many folks. But I also think about curiosity. What you said is when we are robbed of our ability to be curious is often when we think we already know. If we think we have the answers, then we don't go chasing them. And I think that that's been part of it too. That for many people who do not live the experience of being Black primarily in this moment's conversation, but being a person of color at all, they don't ask that. They think they might already kind of understand that externally. And there isn't maybe as much of an acknowledgement that you cannot understand something you haven't lived ever. It's always a pursuit of an understanding. And it's going to take more work than you think. And then you kind of get to the other side of that, which is maybe people didn't think that they had to understand it. They know enough about it. Society is structured well enough to do as much as is needed to make sure that America lives up to its values. And that's also been a myth that's been being busted right now. It's like, of course, that's not true. That's not been true for a long time for a whole lot of people. And it's not true even today, 2020, which sounds like such a futuristic year, for like people who've been around.
We were supposed to have flying cars by now, weren't we?
Right. We were supposed to be out in space. We're not out in space.
We're working on Mars.
We're down here trying to figure out our own planet and our own society and our own humanity still. So I think about a lot of those things.
Maleena, do we have your audio, Maleena? Okay, I am seeing.
So.
Okay, there we are. Okay, beautiful. Maleena, where we sort of started off with the conversation was, I had sort of posed this question: what are the things that prevent us from being able to have kind of effective, empathetic conversations across the racial divide? Joy pointed to the fact that we don't have frequently when it comes to, sort of majority of white Americans, and, not intentionally, I think necessarily, but there's this ignorance on the cultural and historical kind of lineage and experience that has led to people of color's current experience in American life, right? And Black people in particular, obviously. And Monica was speaking to sort of the fact that, for many folks, when you don't realize the importance of knowing the answer to a question, you don't go looking for that answer. But now we're in this moment where Americans, generally speaking, are, I think, opening up their ears to learning more about cultural experiences and as a means of understanding the moment that we're in racially right now. Maleena, the question I want to ask you is, when we're engaging in cross-cultural dialogue, on the one hand, I think that a lot of folks, certainly folks of color, certainly Black folks, can sometimes feel a certain frustration that there's not a greater awareness of certain important facts and sort of cultural histories leading into a given conversation. On the other hand, I think that, we want to make space in dialogue, in relationships, for folks to enter into conversations, maybe from a place of not knowing, but to feel welcome in those spaces. And one thing I know from talking to a lot of folks, not just white folks, but certainly a lot of white folks, is that sometimes they don't feel as if they have permission to really participate on equal grounds in conversations over race, because the idea of them having white privilege or some other thing makes them feel as if they're not really wanted in a dialogue as equals. So I run into this tension sometimes. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, and just generally speaking, what's sort of the spirit that we have to bring to cross-cultural conversations to make it something that can actually produce an edification for all parties involved that can lead to greater understanding, as opposed to having conversations break down?
That's an excellent question. And I think we've been asking those questions, and as Black people, we've been sitting in that space for quite some time. And now that it's here, it's almost like you mentioned the word, sometimes you have the facts of the matter. And historically speaking, we have tons of facts that surround cultural intersections and even spirituality, like the spirit of things. And if I were to think about just the spirit of things as to where we are right now in this moment, and I think I mentioned it before, this moment was doomed to happen. And I believe that for every action, there's a reaction. And this is just a consequence that has been bubbling up, if you will. It's like I'm drinking ginger beer. And if I were to shake this bottle up and I open it immediately after shaking up this cold ginger beer, it would just erupt. And I think that that's where we are as a country. I think that's where we are, as Monica mentioned, a planet. And, Joy dropped it earlier. I was listening in as to just where we see and where we stand is something that's inevitable. So when you are in inevitable situations, I was always taught to see things, like step away, to answer, like to give answer to step away, observe, you know, don't be the problem. Let's look at it and see where all the problem areas are. And in every system, which was mentioned, every system at this time is coming into question. We also have to know that every system needs to be willing. And if they're not willing, they meaning white people, and in some cases, Black people, and in some, all people, you know, we're saying that it's not just Black, when Black lives matter, all lives matter. That's a fact. Because if you look at it historically speaking, John, you mentioned before racism, even before the racism, the colonization, before colonization happened, and we were kings and queens all over the planet. You know, we were civilized people, civilized, like Black people are civilized. We are so filled with compassion, filled with forgiveness. Think about it, from civil rights to Black power. If we just looked at slavery within 400 years and then the insight of uprisings, these uprisings came because we were so peacefully handling things. We were peacefully handling things. We were reasoning with our brothers and sisters, be it whatever color. And we were laying it all on the line for Jesus. And in some cases, other religions popped up. But that spiritual moment, the spiritual awakening of indigenous people, of original beings, of Black people being able to walk in their authority and their light and their love and be seen as human beings cannot be, it can't be covered and it can't be erased. So we can say the execution of George Floyd erupted this moment, but before George, there were thousands of undocumented individuals, Black men, women, and children. When you blatantly kill a child, when I say when you blatantly, I mean you equals to me. And when I'm speaking right now as you, I'm thinking of white men that are white supremacists or white children who were taught by their parents, or a society that carries a genealogy of superiority to say we don't matter, we don't care, you know, they're subservient. They just go on what we say and what we do. But we've known before, we as Black people already knew our power. We knew our we knew our structure, we knew our value, but along the lines it diminished and we started being quiet about what we bring to the table. Now I feel that we are owning our worth. We've searched for it long enough. We're saying our Black dollars matter. In this day, we're proving that. But we should be everybody, not just Black people, but I think the world, especially white people, can come to the table with an open heart and being willing to heal, willing to reveal the truth, willing to admit their benefit and how their benefits deal in equality, and to honestly say to themselves, is this right? Because some people might just be okay with it. Some white people might just be okay with white privilege. And that's fine, but it just won't serve. It doesn't serve anymore. And I think as Black people, even myself, I find places and spaces in my mind where I question. I'm like, oh, that's conditioning. That's conditioning. I'm good. I'm worthy. I'm here. I deserve to be here. This is my seat too. And that's my seat too is saying to me, rather than you go from that's my seat too to that's my seat. This is our table. How can we build together? And until we are at a place and space where we're acknowledged as human beings beyond the Constitution, beyond the Emancipation of Proclamation, beyond all the articles, and we show up in a courtroom and we're treated the same way, we're sentenced or heard out the same way, then we're going to always be fighting from this day forward. That's how I feel. And the fight deserves to be won. And it deserves to be heard. And our youth deserve the support as well as across the generational lines. We deserve to be able to unify. And once we do, be it our Black dollars or our collective power in organizing and mobilizing around economic justice, healthcare, spirituality, because that's a whole way too. You know, when we start rising all of a sudden, we've seen it historically. When Black people take care of Black people, when we start to really bubble up, if you will, things happen that are good things. And I don't think that good things deserve to be knocked down by bad people who are envious of our power, envious of our genetic, genius. And so we're going to keep doing this. And I think we all need to come together, and to our white brothers and sisters, I feel like my grandma used to say, excuse my language, and my mama say it too, you shit or get off the pot. And so I think that is the time we're living in, where it's just like we have to make some sound, conscious decisions that bring us spiritual alignment. And then we're able to see each other beyond race. But I feel, I don't know how y'all feel, but sometimes I feel like when people say, it's not a race thing, we got to move beyond race. Before we move beyond race, though, we have to be seen as human beings. Otherwise, we'll keep coming back through a cycled issue of race matters in America. Yeah,
I definitely have some thoughts on that subject. I think, okay, I see Joy's hands up. Joy, then Monica here very quickly.
Okay. And because I want to yes and to what Maleena said, and also talk about the part of what you asked in your question, John, about when white people are saying sometimes they don't feel like they are able to participate in the space, like they're not invited to participate in the space. I always wonder what people mean by participate. Like, is participate, I want to be able to talk to, like, I don't want to listen and learn about something that I don't know about so that I can get educated and actually expand my understanding, or I want to be able to jump into the fray of the conversation. Participation isn't always about being able to talk. Participation is a lot of times about listening. I just before we had this started recording this, I was listening to an Afro-Latina led conversation about colorism within the Latinx community. I am not an Afro-Latina. I can participate in the colorism conversation, especially when it's in relation to the Black community, but I don't need to jump into the fray of the Afro-Latina conversation. I wanted to show up and listen and learn and understand what they were saying about Dominican history, about the Dominican in relation to Haitian history and things like that. So participation, sometimes people need to expand their definition of participation. If you don't know about something, like what Monica was saying earlier, if you've had no frame of reference for it, how are you going to get frame of reference if you're talking more than you're listening?
Yeah. Monica.
Yeah, and I'll follow up to that, because I do think that is a difficult thing to ask a human being. It is a difficult thing, if we look at it, just as it is, to ask a human being to participate only by listening, that whatever they feel inside is just right now not the point, is right now maybe not relevant, is right now maybe not useful. And I think that's been a big part of the turmoil and the tension, right? I mean, we see that is, I love that you asked that question, because I'd never thought of it that way before, Joy. But what does it mean to participate? And if people think participating means I'm going to do and say whatever I feel, and, just based on sort of my default factory settings on participating in conversations, then there is, a group of people and a school of conversing and of being in this moment right now that would say, that is not a good way to participate. So I think that's one of the fault lines. That's one of the places where it's been difficult for folks to show empathy, come to these conversations open, but also honest, but also themselves, but also feeling welcome, but also remembering it's not really about them, in the case of white people. All of this stuff is a jumble of confusing messages to a lot of folks. So I wanted to ask everyone, including you, John, if you're up for it. I wonder if we could each share a conversation that we've had recently with anyone who does not see the racial justice question the way we do, that was productive, that felt like a connection was made, even though the levels were different, and what made that conversation productive.
Yeah, I
Good question.
there's a degree to which I sort of there's a degree to which I sort of specialize in these conversations because, as you guys know, I mean, I tend to walk in a bunch of different worlds, and on this race topic in particular, I was being interviewed by a podcast host recently who just sort of looking at his previous output. You know, I mean, I got the sense that he tended to look at politics coming out of the mainstream of the Black community as centering around identity politics, centering around grievance, but not necessarily really being tied into the sort of truth of what's really going on. In other words, I mean, you know, we made so much progress, you know, leading out of the civil rights movement. This idea of institutional racism overlooks the fact that it's really our personal choices that sort of lead us to where we are as a community, or where any community gets to. You know, if Black folks would just make better choices on a community sort of basis, better individual choices, we would be at a better place, and we wouldn't have so much to complain about. I mean, you know, I'm summarizing it in a very kind of, you know, simplistic sort of way, but that was the larger sort of attitude, and I'm familiar with that perspective. Look, I'm I'm a Republican. I think of myself as conservative in many respects. You got many Black folks who have that similar sort of point of view, and the germ of the truth in that is that obviously we always, as a community, have to take responsibility for what goes on within our community and hold each other accountable to live up to the best aspects of who we are and what our tradition is. And so, you know, that aspect of it in my mind is fair. So what I tried to do was to sort of acknowledge that part of the legitimacy of it, but then sort of make a larger sort of case that, look, I mean, you're right about the importance of personal responsibility. You're right about the necessity of community empowerment. At the same time, and you and I are in agreement on this, right? At the same time, it's important to look at the fact that the way institutions evolve, one, that interacts with culture, two, a lot of things happened in America after the 1960s that were detrimental and damaging to Black America, that are not in the story that we tell ourselves about American history following the civil rights movement. For a lot of folks, American history following the civil rights movement is sort of and they lived happily ever after period. You know, Dr. King died, but racism was vanquished, and, you know, therefore, you know, the promised land was achieved. And I do think that incredible strides were made in that period. And I think that Dr. King did touch the heart of America in a deep and meaningful way that continues to resonate to this day. But in the case of this particular conversation, when I sort of affirmed sort of what it is this individual already thought in terms of pointing to what is true in what he was saying, but then, you know, sort of using that agreement to purchase some open-mindedness to the things that he may not have thought about before, I found him to be, you know, open, very much open to hearing what I was saying. By the end of it, I think I'd sort of, you know, I think that his perspective had been expanded. But, you know, I mean, one of the things at Braver Angels that we sort of stress is the importance of, even if it seems like a small thing, kind of finding those points of agreement to start with and kind of building from that where you can. Every situation is different, though, clearly. And so I've got some other thoughts about what Maleena had said earlier. But yeah, I mean, Joy or Maleena, if you guys have an anecdote or anything you want to share, yeah, for sure, go for it. Mm-hmm.
I was actually ransacking my brain on conversations that I've had that are leading to healing. And lately, one conversation comes to mind only. It was about defunding the police and why is it such a big deal? We need the police. And I was making the case, and this was with the older white gentleman. I was just making a case. I wasn't even making a case. We were just talking. Right. And he was just like he had a very, I was getting coffee. And he said, well, you know, actually it was a sidebar, and I just happened to be in line, and it was two white men talking. And I was just like, I naturally went like this. And they were talking about the protests that were going on every night downtown Los Angeles. And I listened for a while and went until my body reacted. And that's when I just said, really? My really response was to when he said, you know, it just should blow over. It should just blow over. And I said, you think it's gonna blow over? You really think it's just gonna blow over? And I was like, why you think it's gonna blow over? And his buddy was like, and this is this two things happened in this one coffee line. And he was like, because every generation has its moment. And I'm an old white man. I mean, I've been through it all. So I've seen lots of stuff. And I was like, yeah, but I got a different feeling about this, man. I got a different feeling. I don't think this is going to just blow over. And don't you think that's the problem? Because things had just blown over before in the times that you're probably talking about. He was just like, well, every generation has this moment and every generation gets over it. And I might not live to see what's going to happen with this generation, but it just get over it. It just blow over. I said, oh, wow. Okay. Well, Black Lives Matter. And then it just happened just like that. There was no fight to win. There was no battle. You know, I reacted to a conversation that they were having. It was a sidebar. And he was in his conviction. And I chose to be like, you really think it, you know, is just going to blow over. But in his mind, this is a blimp. In my mind, in my life, and in my conviction, I'm committed to this is not blowing over. If anything, it's just the beginning. This is just a protest. Protest comes with a whole lot of asks and demands. Now that's where my mind is. And meanwhile, a white lady jumped in front of me without saying, excuse me, and was grabbing her coffee order. And I said, ma'am, you could have said, excuse me. Well, I called mine in. I'm just jumping in to ask. And it did not matter to her. And so we argued. She and I actually argued back and forth. Same coffee line. And then I looked at a couple. One was an Indian girl with an Asian guy. And she looked at me and she was like.
So they're all
all in one line, you know, yeah. And it really baffled me. So to your point, John, we just got work to do. I mean, it was that, and with the white lady, she was like, sorry. And I was just like, it ain't about being sorry. Don't be sorry. Use your manners. That's all I could say to her. Because the other part of me, I wanted to react in a different type of way. And that's not who I wanted to be. But I was like, that's why white people get their butt whooped. You know what I mean? You scrolling on Instagram and you see how people react. And I was just like, she's not worth it for one, but you can see how things can take you somewhere when you're stressed or people are being insensitive. So two things in one coffee line that happened in Larchmont.
So I'm a white guy, right? At least, you know, my father is white. And the Wood family is, it's an interesting thing because right now the Wood family is in the process of changing colors, literally. I mean, you know, I'm the only one of my generation within the Wood family who has children. My children are African-American. My kids are Black. I mean, you know, my wife is Black. I'm what folks call mixed, right? And so, you know, I've seen this process by which America is becoming more and more a product of all people kind of, you know, blending, not just directly in terms of interracial marriage and whatnot, but trying to acclimate to the fact that there are voices from across the spectrum of cultural experience that are defining what America is in a self-conscious sort of way. You know, I mean, I've seen this process unfold in sort of my own family, right? The reason I mention sort of, you know, the white side of my family and so forth is that, I feel like I have a pretty strong understanding of what Monica was alluding to earlier, of this frustration that a lot of white people feel about feeling as if there is some abridgment of their own liberties in terms of not being able to speak up in a certain conversation. And you see this boiling over on college campuses sometimes, where there'll be a space set aside for people of color to be able to heal, to be able to converse. And then you'll see segments on Fox News talking about the reintroduction of segregation and so forth on college campuses driven by people on the political left and so forth. And there's this larger sort of sense that, well, wait a second, doesn't this kind of push against, the sanctity and importance of free speech and so forth? And I believe in free speech. I mean, I believe in the idea that we need to work through our problems by communicating, and everybody's got a right to communicate and speak their piece. But to what Joy and Monica, to sort of what you guys were talking about, there is a difference between, I think, having the right to speak on the one hand, and on the other hand, thinking in terms of what is the most effective way for us to participate in communication that actually advances understanding and progress. And very oftentimes, the right way to participate, and this is in a variety of contexts, is to be willing to, in the words of our friend, my friend Pierce Godwin, to listen first, right? To have the humility to be able to take in what's being discussed in front of someone. And so there's responsibility on that side of the cultural conversation, I think, to be open to the value of listening. At the same time, Maleena, you talked about the value and the power of the Black spiritual tradition, right? And the way in which a tremendous part of the gift that the African-American community has given to America, I think, over the course of its history is this sort of moral uplift that has been born from a deep and sort of pervasive suffering that has also bred a tremendous compassion for other people who have suffered. And that sort of openness to helping to heal the wounds of other people was a tremendous part of the culture of not just but also not just the civil rights movement, but including the civil rights and the nonviolent movement. It's why folks like, British intellectuals like Christopher Hitchens in recent years, and people in his own time referred to the leaders of the nonviolent movement as the moral tutors of the nation, right? Because we were achieving social progress using love as an actual power, I think, for catalyzing change. And so, Joy, I wanted to ask you, because in your work, part of what you do is educate people in terms of the real sort of complexity and pervasiveness of the sort of social programming of discrimination and sort of pushing forward the status quo of inferiority as it pertains to Black people through the vehicle of entertainment in American history. I'm wondering if you have a sense in terms of, how do you go about communicating a history that complex to people who fall outside of that tradition, while also being able to sort of preserve enough kind of space to say that, you as a human being taking this information in are valuable, but this is sort of a project of education for everybody's benefit, but it requires the space to sort of listen empathetically. In other words, how do you do that in a way that doesn't just come off as sort of like trying to beat it into folks? How do you present that information in a way that folks outside of the Black tradition actually receive?
Well, I hope I can answer this question.
No wrong answer. Whatever Joe says is on the
okay, so with CME, the Center for Intersectional Media and Entertainment, one of the reasons why I co-founded this with Dr. Nicole Haggard and Monica Lay was because we ended up in a cohort together of 50 women who were dedicated to gender parity and media entertainment by 2025. And we started talking about, our personal stories, the work that we did individually, because I also do brand strategy and cultural strategy, as well as producing. So I go into ad agencies and production companies, and I have data and I have data points, and we shape whole narratives and campaigns and understanding around, particular data. So I've always monitored culture for myself as part of my coping mechanism to survive what I was experiencing sometimes because of my body, as well as for, you know, educational purposes, because I got disrupted by a question that I sought to answer. When I met Dr. Nicole and Monica, I found kindred spirits in the fact that we were all willing to call a thing a thing.
Shout out to Dr. Nicole, by the way.
Yes, it's like, and so we were all willing to call a thing a thing. And the thing is white supremacy. It's an ideology. It's not a person. We're not looking for the someone in the hood, you know, burning a cross. We are talking about a thought virus. And I do find it very interesting that this conversation came forward during another virus, right? To talk about how to fight the invisible thing that has symptoms that are visible. So by going ahead and acknowledging that it's white supremacy ideology, and therefore we all have a relationship to it. I know I do. I can't tell someone what it's like to be darker than me or lighter than me, but I know what it's like to be this shade in this country, and also a woman on top of that, and to have this hair texture, right? And to straighten this hair versus have my hair in full shrinkage. I know this. And I know what my relationship, I've been unpacking my relationship to white supremacy ideology, even though I am Black, by the definitions of race and race theory in this country. So to go ahead and call a thing and say, this is what we are working to educate ourselves through and rally together against and fight our way through this. It is white supremacy ideology. And then when we go and we look at actually Hollywood and the history of Hollywood, you can't argue with what's on film. You can't argue with the production code that actually had anti-miscegenation guidelines in the code. This was written, okay? You cannot argue with the way that representation got regulated, that bodies got regulated, and that on film, it became about how certain bodies could occupy certain spaces and places, and other bodies could not. It's very difficult to argue with a quote from a Cinema Owners Association that actually stated they were not willing to show any movie in their theater that had Blacks and whites on screen together, unless the Negro was portrayed in a servile capacity to the white person. And then you fast forward to things like Driving Miss Daisy and The Help, right? And magical Negroes like Bagger Vance, right? And you see how certain storylines got monetized. Right. And once money is involved in it, now it's got energy. So this means that all of this got funded, right? And it shows up. These stories matter because their stories shape our beliefs, and our beliefs shape our reality, right? Sometimes if you don't see it, you don't know you can be it. That's just part of being human for a lot of people. So this is not so much about who you think you are when you sit by yourself, right? This is about what we have collectively inherited and why, for some reason, you know, we thought there's a lot of people that thought it was a better idea to build monuments to slave holders than to abolitionists. So what is this really about for a lot of people? What are they feeling threatened about? Where are they trying to hold on to? Maybe holding on to something that is just familiar. And you can just go to Instagram and find plenty of memes that say, just because you are familiar with a toxic relationship doesn't mean you have to keep participating in it. White supremacy ideology has not been very healthy for white people either. It's been very toxic for everyone because it has, in my opinion, this is the only way that I know how to describe it. It has sought to change the very nature of people, who you would be, how you would show up in the world. It's a type of spiritual warfare. And it is a spiritual wickedness that we have been abiding. And this is what is being called into question. Every generation gets to decide what they want to pedestalize and what they want to tear down. Every generation gets to decide who they revere as heroes, if they even want to really make anyone heroes. Sainthood, most of the time, requires a lot of editing. So do we really need to canonize people? Or do we need to actually look at the full bread of someone, the crust and all, right? Maybe that's how we learn more. Maybe that's how we get through. So that's really how we frame it, that this is not necessarily something that you're doing. I'm not saying I'm going to go into your closet and find a hood and a robe. Okay. Mm-hmm. This isn't about, who you're striving to not be. And to talk about this as white supremacy doesn't mean that you are a white supremacist. No one on this call is a white supremacist, but everyone has a relationship to it. And this isn't, I don't really think that this is a political thing or a difference of opinion. How do you found an entire nation on an idea that you are a whole person and someone else is 3/5 of a person because of their body? Mm-hmm. How do you go about removing people from their land, then putting them in schools to de-Indianize them, then classifying them as white in some states to assimilate them? If this is not about some sort of ideological framework, and we actually have the notes from a lot of these theorists where they created pyramids of humanity. And at the bottom was Black, and at the top, the most evolved version of human was white. This is the conversation. This isn't about necessarily you doing something untoward you, individual people being racist per se, but it is about apathy and about innocence and immunity to how this ideology has affected lots of other people, everyone that doesn't look like you.
And see, that gets to, so you've hit this distinction, Joy, a few times. And by the way, folks, be on the lookout with the Braver Angels 2020 calendar, because we're going to have some in-depth conversations about American history, about Black history, and it's going to be a pleasure, Joy, to invite you back to expound in greater depth on this history that you are you're particularly authoritative on, and I've learned a lot from you in our conversations. But there's this distinction, I think. So folks obviously have difficulty with the term white supremacy, right? Because when you say that, America is operating under a white supremacist system, I think the way a lot of folks hear that, and not just white folks, but certainly many white people, they hear that as being a personal indictment of the human beings themselves. That, in other words, you're saying that this is a white supremacist country. You're saying that I am a white supremacist, that I'm like these people who are lynching Black folks, people who would, wear Nazi tattoos or march with tiki torches in Charlotte or what have you. People, I think, on an emotional level feel that that's what that is saying. And obviously, in a conversation like we're having now, Joy, quickly cutting into sort of the substance of the perspective and drawing a contrast between the person and the idea of white supremacy as an ideological systemic construct. I think that I just want to, as we come into our closing moments here, I want to jump into that, because I feel like that's one of the big barriers for a lot of people being able to participate in even listening and learning from the subject, because I think a lot of white people feel so personally kind of demonized by the label that it's hard to hear the arguments that follow. Maleena, do you have sort of a feeling on that dynamic? In your words, what is important, whether folks want to agree or disagree with the perspective? What do you think is important for folks to understand about what Black people are really saying, when the conversation turns to the subject of white supremacy being a problem in America? What does that really mean for folks who don't understand?
I think what it means to people who really don't understand or are becoming even more educated about wanting to understand, since we're seeing people who really, we're identifying people who really want to participate, or how do they participate in the conversation of dismantling racism, is to acknowledge that first and foremost, racism exists in this country. And if you were living in a gated community, in a gated mindset community mindset that's gated, and you only see your life through one dimension, and that lens is, then your lens is clouded, because there's a whole world that you're still cohabitating in. And with that being said, I think we all owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to this country to help America heal, is to reveal that this land, this country that we're living in, this hemisphere, was founded on white supremacy. And that is only saying that, Joy broke it down. I mean, from the pyramids to, colorism, to just identifying psychology, even. The mere fact that one can go to therapy and are even receiving therapy for mental health services. I'm rearing to the left, but I'm gonna come right back to the center. Receiving, mental health services is, you have to qualify and quantify for that to get help, to even change your mind. And it looks different from a cultural mindset. There's so many cultural biases to receive help, to be identified. And so in my mind, and what you're saying, and what this world, how this world invites all races, it's so disingenuous. And so to live in a country where we want to build an opportunity and create a true fabric, everybody say the fabric of America, the true fabric of America, if we really want to clean it and bleach out the bloodstains, that's going to take a lot of work. And so for white supremacy to be brought to the surface and really bleached out, it's
the pun there.
Yeah, I just caught myself. It really hurts. It's pain. There's so much pain attached. And the pain that's inflicted upon Black people, and then all people, because if we're hurting and carrying this much pain, it was reflected in the streets of all across the world. What we're seeing, the reaction to white supremacy, is people saying no more, because no one wants to be seen as half human, partial human. We have a universal declaration of human rights. It's time that we actually be seen as completely human beings. And to start that, we have to admit that white supremacy is a disease, and it's also a moral insult to people who really live and give their whole entire being to this country, be it fought in war or just fought every day and being a good neighbor. So in white supremacy, to answer your question, John, it starts with understanding what it is, and really for white people to be able to pinpoint that it's a problem, and understand and start to break it down for themselves, how it poses as a problem, even if not for themselves, for their children, for our society, for the workplace. It's systemic. It gives you a clear cut of the haves and have-nots. You can read the Willie Lynch letter, and you can go and you can see the breakdown. You can see the breakdown into white Jesus versus Black Jesus through, the arms of religion and spirituality that you mentioned earlier. I know we didn't talk about it, but it's true. It's true. It's almost like this right now is like watching an episode of Boondocks on heroin. What we're seeing right now is it's like, for real, granddaddy. I'll be feeling like, wow. And I'm actually excited. I'm excited for healing, and I'm excited for, white supremacists to have this opportunity to show face, so that we don't have to say much. People are seeing it for themselves. And this is where social media, I think, is becoming a positive tracker. It can be still too much for me, but it is becoming a positive tracker on incidences and reports, so that it's like, if you don't believe me, you don't believe Joy, if you don't believe Moni, if you don't believe John, go to Instagram, go to Facebook, somebody else caught it. And now, since we can call it out, we should use that for the force of good and call it out, so that we can really rebuild, reconstruct, and reinstitute values in a society that actually takes care of all her people, not just one kind, equally.
Right. I know that there are going to be people listening to our conversation here who I imagine are going to be triggered and feel some resistance again to this phrase, right? And to this larger characterization of America. And yet, part of what I'm hoping comes through in this conversation, because this is the beginning of a dialogue here, and that what we're having here in Braver Angels, mirroring what's happening across the country, right, is an understanding of the fact that when folks talk about white supremacy, this is not a reflexive condemnation of white people for being white people, I think. But rather, this is many folks, and certainly many folks in the Black community, looking at the historical kind of arc that has led us here and how it is interacting with the context of our current moment, in which we're seeing a range of difficulties and tragedies unfolding. This is the way that many folks are identifying a certain phenomenon in social life. Now, I think that a big part of the premise of our work is bringing people into closer engagement with each other so that the truth spoken from every perspective can find their way to meeting each other and edifying each other. And so I want to thank folks who have taken the time to listen to this conversation, to listen to Joy, listen to Maleena, to Monica, for having the open ears to be able to sort of, take in the authentic expression of this point of view. And I'm hoping that folks will want to engage it further as we go into the conversations and the programs that we're going to have over the course of the Braver Angels 2020 campaign. And so, Joy, Maleena, looking forward to you two being a very important part of that, honestly. And you two both know that you have my immense respect and personal affection. We are friends, as are so many of the people who are listening to us right now, people I love and respect and adore. This is hard stuff. Growth is hard, in all directions. And the process by which we grow, the process by which we learn, it requires a lot from us, in the way of humility and being able to take in the experiences of other people. And of course, that's a human reality. That's for all folks. But we're in this moment where this racial conversation, it's always mattered. It really matters right now. And we need to have the sort of, open-mindedness to engage it, I think, in a good faith sort of way. So this isn't the end. This is the beginning. Monica, you never fail to say something that I think hits close to the moral center of any conversation. Do you have any closing thoughts to take us home with?
Yeah, I mean, thank you everyone for being real about all of this. To echo what John was saying, white supremacy, Black Lives Matter, anti-racism. There's a lot of people in this country for whom just hearing those words sparks a lot of anxiety. And I think about this moment as, with the book lists and people buying all the books and reading them, one unfortunate consequence of our intense divisions in this country is that usually when there is something to learn, there's only one piece of America that's going to learn it, because the other pieces are split off. And Jonathan Haidt has a great framework for thinking about how we approach ideas that we immediately react against. And he says that when we hear an idea that we immediately sort of emotionally like, we'll ask ourselves, can I believe it? But when we hear an idea we immediately emotionally don't like, we'll ask, must I believe it? And the difference between those two questions is so key, because if you're asking, must I believe it? All you need is one little reason not to believe it, which for me is why Black Lives Matter took so long to feel like not just a left political thing to a lot of people in this country, right? My parents are conservative. I've had a dozen hours easily of conversations about race with them. And, Black Lives Matter started out being politically a thing that they could not support because it was of the left in their mind, right? And it has evolved. But what that often requires for people to work through that anxiety, you know, people were able to say Black Lives Matter. Must I believe it? Must I believe it? All lives matter. Oh yeah, all lives matter. I don't have to believe Black Lives Matter. I just found this all lives matter thing, right? And it took years and people are still on that, right? So that to me is one of the biggest challenges, because like you said, Joy, you know, white supremacy is real. it's you call it what it is. And unfortunately, the names for things, it's as a negotiation teacher that I once had, Brian Mendel, said, it's not what you say, it's what people hear, right? So someone says white supremacy, they mean this ideological system, they mean this, you know, historical context, they mean all those things you mentioned. Someone hears white supremacy and they hear, I'm evil, right? Getting past all of that, getting through all of that and becoming wiser on the other end is, I think, going to require a lot of connections that we have been severing to get reattached, and a lot of time and a lot of conversations and some patience. And sometimes you don't have patience. Sometimes change needs to happen right the F now. And so that battle between, well, what, we're supposed to wait? No, we got to charge forward. And then how do you bring America forward together? Maybe it's only a couple inches, but those inches will be significant. So there it is, John. I don't know if that met your...
We're going to get through it. We're going to get through it, ladies. We will.
We're going to get through it.
And yeah, once again, no, I appreciate that, Monica. And no, this is a running dialogue. It really is. And so we're not stopping. Maleena, thank you so much. Joy, it is an honor and a privilege, to talk to you always. And Monica, once again, always a pleasure to share the microphone with you. Until next time, for folks who want to know more about our work, it is braverangels.org. Join us as a member. Like, share, subscribe to the podcast. We are building a house united, and you will hear from us next time. Until then.